Hey guys, tonight we're stepping out of the dazzling glare of the digital age and into a much dimmer, quieter world. A world lit by candlelight and the painstaking efforts of human hands. Imagine a time before instant news, before overflowing bookshelves, before even the humble printed leaflet advertising a local market. Tonight, we're exploring how the invention of the printing press, an event we often associate with grand religious reformations and lofty intellectual awakenings, also quietly, almost stealthily, began to transform the everyday lives of ordinary people in late medieval Europe. We're going beyond books to see how this new technology started to weave itself into the very fabric of daily existence. Now, if you were suddenly dropped into a 14th century village without your smartphone or even a simply printed notice for the village fair, you probably won't survive this without a serious case of information withdrawal and social bewilderment. The sheer effort to get any information was intense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a world where the written word is a rare and precious commodity, a world largely before the clatter of Johannes Gutenberg's revolutionary invention. This is the late medieval period, perhaps the early 15th century. The vast majority of people you encounter are illiterate. Knowledge, news, and stories are primarily transmitted orally, through sermons in church, songs sung by traveling minstrels, gossip exchanged at the village well or marketplace, and tales told around the hearth on a long winter's night. Your understanding of the wider world, of history, even of your own faith, is largely shaped by what you hear, not what you read. For those few who can read, or for institutions like monasteries and universities that require written texts, the production of a book, or rather a manuscript, is an incredibly laborious and expensive process. You're in a scriptorium, perhaps within the quiet, cold stone walls of a monastery. Here, monks. The scribes of this era hunch over wooden desks, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a tallow candle or the grayish daylight filtering through a small, unglazed window. The air is thick with the scent of parchment made from animal skins, sheep, goat, or calf. Ink often made from oak galls and iron salts, or soot, and perhaps the faint, musty smell of old vellum. Each letter, each word, is painstakingly copied by hand from an existing manuscript onto a fresh sheet of prepared animal skin. The scribe uses a quill pen, likely made from a goose feather, which needs constant resharpening with a small knife. A single mistake could ruin hours of work, necessitating careful scraping with the knife or a piece of pumice to correct the error, or sometimes starting the entire page anew. It's slow, meticulous, eye-straining work. A historical fact for you, it could take a single scribe many months, even years, to produce just one copy of a substantial book, like the Bible. As a result, manuscripts were incredibly valuable, often chained to desks in libraries to prevent theft, or kept under lock and key. Owning even a few manuscripts was a sign of considerable wealth and status. You didn't exactly have a beach read section in your local medieval bookstore because, well, there weren't really local medieval bookstores in the way we think of them. The materials themselves were costly. Parchment, as mentioned, required the skin of an animal. A whole flock of sheep might be needed for one Bible. The inks had to be carefully prepared. Illustrations, if any, were often hand-painted with expensive pigments, sometimes including gold leaf, by skilled artists called illuminators. This entire process meant that access to written knowledge was severely restricted. It was largely the domain of the church, royalty, nobility, and a small but growing class of scholars and wealthy merchants. For the average peasant tilling the fields, or the artisan in a small-town workshop, the world of books was as distant and inaccessible as the moon. Their daily lives were governed by the seasons, by local custom, by the word of the local priest or lord, not by written laws they could consult or news they could read for themselves. A quirky tidbit from this era because parchment was so expensive. It was sometimes recycled. Monks would take an old manuscript, scrape off the existing ink, a process creating what's called a palimpsest, and write a new text over the faint traces of the old one. Modern technology sometimes allows us to recover these hidden, older texts, offering fascinating glimpses into lost works or earlier versions of known ones. Imagine finding an ancient grocery list hidden beneath a philosophical treatise. Remember to buy more anachronistic avocados for the bishop. Historians still argue about the exact literacy rates in medieval Europe before the printing press, but it's generally agreed they were very low. Perhaps only 5 to 10% of the adult male population in many areas, and even lower for women. Reading and writing were specialized skills, often learned in monastic schools or by those destined for careers in the church or administration. This limited literacy, combined with the scarcity and expense of handwritten materials, meant that the flow of information was slow, controlled, and often localized. News of distant events might take weeks or months to arrive, distorted by multiple retellings along the way. Legal documents, contracts, and official pronouncements would be read aloud by a town crier or a priest. Daily life, for most, was lived within a very immediate oral culture. This was the world on the cusp of a seismic shift, a world where the quiet scratch of the scribe's quill was about to be drowned out by the rhythmic clank of a machine that would change everything. You're still in that late medieval world, where the written word is a rare treasure, meticulously crafted by hand. But now, imagine yourself in Mainz, Germany, around the middle of the 15th century, perhaps the 1440s or early 1450s. There's a buzz in certain workshops, a sense of secretive, intense activity. This is where our quiet revolution truly begins to spark. A man named Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith and inventor by trade, is on the verge of perfecting a technology that will fundamentally alter the way information is created, disseminated, and consume the printing press with movable metal type. Now, printing itself wasn't entirely new. Woodblock printing, where an entire page of text and images was carved onto a single block of wood, inked, and then pressed onto paper, had been used in China for centuries and had made its way to Europe. Primarily for producing images like religious icons or playing cards, sometimes with small amounts of text. A key historical fact. The oldest known dated printed book using this woodblock method is the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text from China, printed in 868 CA. So, the idea of pressing an inked surface onto paper to make multiple copies wasn't Gutenberg's unique invention. What Gutenberg ingeniously combined and refined was a suite of technologies movable type individual letters cast in metal that could be arranged and rearranged. An oil-based ink suitable for adhering to metal type, and a screw press adapted from those used in winemaking or papermaking capable of applying firm, even pressure. The real genius lay in creating durable, uniform, and reusable individual letter forms from a metal alloy, likely lead tin, and antimony. This meant that instead of carving a whole new woodblock for every single page, a printer could set a page of type, print as many copies as needed, and then redistribute those same letters to set a completely new page. It was this reusability and efficiency that was truly revolutionary. Imagine the difference between carving "Hello World" onto a potato every time you want to print it, versus having individual potato letters you can just rearrange. Gutenberg effectively invented the world's most sophisticated potato stamp. You can picture Gutenberg and his associates in their workshop, the air smelling of molten metal, oil-based inks, and damp paper. There's the clatter of metal type being sorted into cases, the rhythmic thud of the press, the quiet satisfaction or perhaps intense frustration. In the early days of pulling a freshly printed sheet, it would have been a messy, experimental process, full of trial and error, What was the best metal alloy for the type? How thick should the ink be? How much pressure was needed for a clear impression? These were the challenges they had to overcome. One quirky tidbit is that Gutenberg was apparently quite secretive about his work, likely due to the financial investment involved and the fear of competitors stealing his ideas. There were lawsuits and financial disputes, as is so often the case with groundbreaking, potentially lucrative inventions. He wasn't just a starry-eyed inventor, he was also trying to run a business, albeit one that was inventing its own market. The first major work printed by Gutenberg using his movable type press was, famously, the Gutenberg Bible, completed around 1455. This was a monumental undertaking, a two-volume Latin Bible of incredible quality, designed to rival the finest handwritten manuscripts in its beauty and clarity. Each page was a testament to the potential of this new technology. But producing these Bibles was still a complex and expensive process, and they were certainly not destined for the average person's bookshelf, or lack thereof. The initial impact of the press wasn't an immediate flood of cheap books for everyone. That would come later. The first wave was more about demonstrating the capabilities of the new technology, often by producing high-quality religious texts, classical works, and legal documents for the existing elite market that could afford them. However, even in these early days, the potential for much wider, faster dissemination of information was clear. A printing press could produce hundreds, even thousands of copies of a text in the time it would take a scribe to produce just one. This wasn't just an incremental improvement, it was a quantum leap in the speed and scale of textual reproduction. The genie of mass communication was slowly, clankingly, being let out of the bottle. Historians still debate the precise timeline of Gutenberg's inventions and the exact contributions of other individuals who were also experimenting with printing techniques around the same time in Europe. It's a complex picture, with fragments of evidence and competing claims. However, Gutenberg is generally credited with perfecting the system of movable metal-type printing in a way that made it truly viable and scalable, thus awakening the press in Europe. His innovation wasn't just about making more books, it was about fundamentally changing the relationship between people and information. The quiet scriptoria of the monasteries, with their slow, painstaking process of hand copying, were about to face a formidable new rival, one that promised to take the written word out of the cloister and, eventually, into the hands of a much wider world. The press had awakened, and daily life, though it didn't know it yet, would never be quite the same. Gutenberg's press has clanked into action, and those magnificent, if still very expensive, Bibles are a testament to its potential. But if you think the printing press's early impact on daily life was all about grand theological tomes destined for cathedral libraries, you'd be missing a crucial part of the story. Almost immediately, this new technology began to churn out a whole different category of printed material, cheap, ephemeral, and surprisingly influential items like broadsides, pamphlets, indulgences, and single-sheet notices. These were the affordable sheets, the everyday print that started to filter down and touch the lives of people far beyond the scholarly elite. This wasn't your Netflix of the 15th century, but it was a start to more accessible information. Imagine you're walking through a bustling market town in Germany or Italy in the late 15th or early 16th century, nailed to a church door, or perhaps being sold by a traveling peddler for a tiny coin. You see a freshly printed sheet of paper. It might be a broadside, a single large sheet printed on one side, proclaiming a new ducal decree, or perhaps recounting a sensational and probably highly exaggerated story about a monstrous birth in a nearby village, or even a ballad about a recent battle. This is news, or at least a version of it, available for public consumption in a way that was previously unimaginable. Before, you'd rely on the town crier, whose voice might not carry to every corner, or whose memory might be a bit selective. Now, the words are there, fixed in print, for anyone who could read or have it read to them to see. It's like the difference between hearing a rumor and seeing a posted flyer. The printed word had a new kind of authority and reach. Pamphlets, too, began to proliferate. These were small, unbound booklets, typically a few pages long, quick to produce and cheap to buy. They could contain anything from religious arguments and political polemics to practical advice on farming, satirical verses, or even crude woodcut illustrations depicting current events. During the early years of the Reformation, for example, figures like Martin Luther made incredibly effective use of printed pamphlets to spread their ideas far and wide, reaching a much larger audience than would have been possible through sermons or handwritten letters alone. These pamphlets were the social media hashtags of their day, going viral in a way that could ignite public debate and challenge established authorities. Have you read Brother Martin's latest pamphlet on indulgences? It's causing quite a stir down at the Pig and Whistle, a conversation that simply wouldn't have happened on that scale a generation earlier. A significant historical fact is the printing of indulgences by the Catholic Church. These were certificates that, for a payment, offered remission from temporal punishment for sins. The Church was one of the earliest large-scale adopters of printing for this very purpose, as it allowed for the mass production of these official documents. Ironically, the widespread sale of printed indulgences became one of the key grievances that fueled Martin Luther's Reformation, which then, in turn, used the printing press to attack the practice. The press was a tool, and it could serve many masters. Beyond the grand sweep of news and religious debate, these affordable printed sheets began to seep into more mundane aspects of daily life. Think about public notices, market regulations, warnings about plague outbreaks, summonses to court. Previously, these might have been proclaimed orally or laboriously handwritten and posted. Now, multiple copies could be printed and distributed quickly and cheaply, ensuring a wider and more consistent dissemination of important information. This had a subtle but significant impact on governance and social order. A quirky tidbit from this era of early print is the appearance of Flugschriften, or flying writings in German-speaking lands. These were often highly sensational, illustrated single sheets detailing wondrous events, monstrous births, comets, battles, or scandalous accusations. They were the tabloids of the 15th and 16th centuries, feeding a public appetite for news, novelty, and a bit of a thrill. While their factual accuracy was often dubious, think headlines like "Giant Baby with Two Heads Eats Local Mayor," they demonstrate how print was quickly adopted for popular entertainment and informal news dissemination, reaching an audience that might not be interested in a scholarly Latin text, but was definitely up for a good, gory woodcut and a shocking story. Historians still debate the exact speed and depth of penetration of these early printed ephemera into the daily lives of the largely illiterate majority. How many people actually bought them? How many had them read aloud? How much did they influence popular opinion versus traditional oral channels? It's clear, however, that the sheer availability of these cheap, mass-produced texts marked a significant change. The information landscape was becoming denser, more varied, and accessible to more layers of society, even if indirectly through public readings or word of mouth originating from a printed source. The printing press wasn't just creating books for libraries. It was scattering seeds of information, argument, and entertainment onto the streets. And those seeds were beginning to take root in the everyday consciousness of late medieval people. The world was slowly but surely becoming a more text-saturated environment. The clatter of the printing press isn't just churning out sensational broadsides and religious pamphlets. It's also quietly, almost invisibly, beginning to reshape the very tools of thought and learning language itself, and the way knowledge is recorded and transmitted. Before print, if you were a scribe copying a manuscript, you might encounter variations in spelling, grammar, and even content from one copy to another. Scribes made errors. They sometimes corrected text based on their own understanding or misunderstanding, and regional dialects heavily influenced written forms. The result was a wonderfully diverse, but also somewhat chaotic, textual landscape. Now, with the advent of print, something new starts to happen: standardization. Imagine you're a printer in, say, Venice or Paris in the late 15th century. You're setting type for a new edition of a classical author or a contemporary treatise. You have to make decisions. How will you spell a particular word? Which grammatical construction will you use if the manuscript copy is ambiguous? Because every copy that comes off your press will be identical, your choices, multiplied hundreds or thousands of times, begin to have a homogenizing effect. Printers, often scholarly individuals themselves or working closely with editors, started to develop house styles, leading to more consistent spelling, punctuation, and grammar within their own publications. As certain printing houses became more influential, their particular conventions began to spread, contributing to the gradual standardization of vernacular languages like English, French, German, and Italian. It wasn't an overnight process. Of course, and it took centuries for spelling and grammar to become as regularized as they are today and even now. There's still plenty of debate. Just ask any English teacher about the Oxford comma. But print was a powerful engine driving this linguistic tidying up. You could say printers were the unintentional, and sometimes very intentional, grammar police of the Renaissance. This standardization had a profound impact on learning. Previously, a student reading different manuscript copies of the same text might encounter confusing variations. Now, students across different regions could be working from essentially identical printed editions. This made teaching and scholarship more consistent and facilitated the spread of common intellectual frameworks. A historical fact: the Aldine Press, established by Aldus Manutius in Venice in the 1490s, was particularly famous for producing accurate, well-edited, and affordable pocket-sized editions of Greek and Latin classics. These Aldine editions became hugely influential, helping to spread humanist learning throughout Europe and setting new standards for scholarly printing. Manutius even introduced italic type, supposedly based on Italian humanist handwriting, to save space and make his books more compact. He was the Steve Jobs of 15th century publishing, focused on elegant design and user experience. The very layout of the printed page also began to evolve and standardize. Printers experimented with title pages, which weren't always a feature of manuscripts, page numbers, running heads, tables of contents, and indexes. These features, which we take for granted today, made books much easier to navigate and use for reference. Imagine trying to find a specific passage in a dense, unpaginated manuscript without an index. It would be like searching for a specific grain of sand on a very large, very boring beach. Print made information retrieval far more efficient. Furthermore, the ability to reproduce images with woodcuts and later engravings alongside text meant that scientific and technical knowledge could be disseminated with greater accuracy. Anatomical drawings, botanical illustrations, architectural plans, and mechanical diagrams could now be copied faithfully, reaching a wider audience of students, physicians, engineers, and artisans. While a handwritten copy of an illustration might vary wildly depending on the skill of the copyist, a printed woodcut was consistent. This was crucial for fields where visual accuracy was paramount. One quirky tidbit is the appearance of pattern books for crafts like embroidery or lace making, filled with printed designs that could be copied by artisans. Print was standardizing not just words, but also visual motifs and technical instructions, contributing to a more uniform material culture. Oh, you're using the Strasbourg stitch from page 12 of the new pattern book, terribly chic. Historians still argue about the precise speed and social depth of these standardizing effects. How quickly did printers' conventions actually influence common usage among the general population, most of whom were still illiterate, and did standardization lead to a loss of valuable linguistic diversity and regional richness? It's a complex picture, but the overall trend is clear: print acted as a powerful force for linguistic and textual regularization. This, in turn, laid the groundwork for more widespread literacy, more efficient education, and a more unified European intellectual culture. The world of words was becoming less of a wild garden and more of a carefully tended, if still very large and diverse library. The printing press wasn't just reproducing text, it was subtly reformatting the software of the human mind. The printing press is humming, churning out not just scholarly tomes, but those affordable sheets, broadsides, and pamphlets that are starting to pepper the urban landscape. And with this newfound ability to mass produce texts, something else begins to change in the rhythm of daily life, the speed and reach of information itself. Before print, news, official pronouncements, and even juicy gossip traveled at the speed of a horse, a ship, or a person's voice. Now, information begins to take flight on paper wings, flapping its way into public consciousness with unprecedented alacrity. Imagine you're living in a late medieval or early Renaissance town. Important news, a royal decree, the outbreak of war, the death of a king, new market regulations, would typically be proclaimed by a town crier in the public square. He'd ring his bell, gather a crowd, and shout out the message. If you missed it, or if you lived in an outlying village, that you might hear it days later, garbled and secondhand, there was a significant lag, and plenty of room for misinterpretation. Remember that old game of telephone or Chinese whispers? That was basically the medieval news distribution system for most folks. Now, picture the change once local printers get established. That same royal decree can be printed onto hundreds of broadsides within hours of its arrival from the capital. These sheets can be quickly posted on church doors, tavern walls, market crosses, and other public places. Couriers can carry stacks of them to neighboring towns and villages. Suddenly, the official message is visible, fixed, and widely distributed. It's less reliant on the memory or vocal projection of a single individual. This doesn't mean everyone could read it themselves. Of course, literacy was still limited, but it meant that more people had access to the exact wording, as literate individuals could read it aloud to groups in taverns, marketplaces, or family gatherings. The information was less prone to the he said, she said distortions of purely oral transmission. It was like upgrading from a carrier pigeon with a sore throat to a surprisingly efficient, if still somewhat slow, email blast. This had a tangible impact on governance. Rulers could disseminate their laws, edicts, and propaganda much more effectively. Tax requirements, calls to arms, public health warnings like those concerning plague outbreaks, all could be communicated with greater speed and consistency across a wider territory. A historical fact, governments were among the earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of printing for precisely these administrative purposes. They quickly recognized its power to project authority and manage their realms. King Henry VIII of England, for example, made extensive use of the printing press to promote his religious and political agenda during the English Reformation, ensuring his pronouncements reached every corner of his kingdom. Beyond official channels, the press also began to accelerate the spread of unofficial news and current events, often in the form of those sensational Flugschriften or news sheets we talked about. While their accuracy was often questionable, think 16th century clickbait, Pope captured by pirates world to end. Next Tuesday, details inside. They catered to a growing public appetite for information about what was happening beyond their immediate locality. Battles, treaties, discoveries in the New World, the deeds and misdeeds of famous personages, all became fodder for these early printed news items. It was the dawn of a more interconnected awareness, a sense that you were part of a larger, unfolding story. You might not be able to verify if the sea monster washes ashore in Naples. Story was true in it, but it was certainly more exciting than just hearing about Farmer Giles's prize-winning turnip for the 10th time. A quirky tidbit from this era is the emergence of news ballads, songs printed on broadsides that recounted recent events, often with a moralizing or entertaining spin. These could be sung in public, further spreading the news in a memorable, accessible format, even to those who couldn't read the sheet music if it was even included or the lyrics. It was news as a sing-along. Of course, this newfound speed and reach of information wasn't always a good thing. From the perspective of those in power, the same press that could disseminate royal decrees could also spread dissenting opinions, criticisms, and calls for rebellion. The cat of information was out of the bag, and it was proving increasingly difficult to control where it roamed. This led to the early development of censorship laws and licensing systems for printers. As authorities tried to manage this powerful new medium, Historians still debate the precise impact of early printed news on the formation of a public sphere or public opinion in the modern sense. How quickly did a shared awareness of events, facilitated by print, translate into collective action or political consciousness among broader segments of the population? It was undoubtedly a gradual process, but the printing press was a key catalyst. It shortened the distances, compressed the timelines, and expanded the horizons of the information world. Daily life was becoming subtly, yet irrevocably, more informed, or at least more saturated with information, both true and dubious. The quiet hum of the village was now occasionally punctuated by the rustle of a news sheet, carrying whispers of a wider, faster-moving world. The printing press isn't just changing how people hear about grand battles or royal scandals. It's also starting to quietly reshape something far more intimate and fundamental to daily life, their perception and organization of time itself. Before the widespread availability of printed materials, your average medieval person's sense of time was largely governed by natural cycles: the rising and setting of the sun, the changing seasons, the phases of the moon, and by the liturgical calendar of the church, with its round of feast days, fast days, and saints' days. Time was somewhat fluid, local, and deeply intertwined with agricultural rhythms and religious observance. But then the presses start to churn out calendars and almanacs, and suddenly time gets a bit more standardized and down on paper. Imagine you're a farmer or a village artisan in, say, 1480. How do you know when to plant your crops, when certain religious festivals fall, or even what day of the week it is with absolute certainty? You might rely on the church bells, the pronouncements of the local priest, or an old, possibly inaccurate, handwritten calendar if your lord or monastery even possessed one that was accessible. It wasn't always precise. But now, a traveling peddler comes through your village selling cheaply printed single-sheet calendars or small almanacs for the coming year. For a small sum, you or someone who can read for you can have a tangible guide to the structure of the year, right there in your own cottage. This was a subtle but profound shift. These early printed calendars were often quite simple, listing the months, the days of the week, major feast days, and perhaps the phases of the moon. But they provided a common, shared framework for time that was more accessible than ever before. A historical fact is that some of the earliest items to come off the printing presses, besides religious texts, were indeed these practical calendars and almanacs, because there was an immediate and widespread demand for them. Printers quickly realized they were a reliable source of income. They were useful, affordable, and people needed a new one every year, the perfect business model. It's like selling printer ink cartridges, but for the 15th century, almanacs in particular became incredibly popular. These were more than just calendars. They were compendia of useful and sometimes not so useful information. A typical printed almanac might include astronomical data, sunrise and sunset times, eclipses, often predicted with varying degrees of accuracy. Astrological forecasts a very serious business for many medieval people. Weather predictions again. Take with a large grain of salt, or perhaps a dry sock. Advice on when to conduct certain agricultural activities, planting, harvesting, bleeding livestock, based on lunar cycles or astrological conjunctions. Medical tips often intertwined with astrology, lists of fairs and market days, and even rudimentary historical chronologies or moral verses. They were the all-in-one pocket guide to life, the medieval equivalent of a smartphone with a dozen different apps, all printed on a few sheets of cheap paper. You wouldn't want to rely on one to perform brain surgery, but for knowing when St. Crispin's Day was, or whether it was a good day to trim your toenails according to the moon, it was invaluable. The widespread availability of these printed timekeepers had several subtle effects on daily rhythms. It helped to synchronize activities across a wider community. If everyone is consulting a similar printed calendar for feast days or market days, it leads to more coordinated social and economic life. It also likely contributed to a more linear, less cyclical, understanding of time for ordinary people. Seeing the year laid out on a page, with numbered days and distinct months, is a different experience from simply living through the ebb and flow of seasons. A quirky tidbit. Some of these early printed almanacs contained rather lurid or sensational prophecies, or highly specific, and often hilariously wrong, predictions for the year ahead. This led to them being both incredibly popular and sometimes viewed with suspicion by church authorities, who worried about the spread of superstition or challenges to official doctrine. Imagine your local priest fulminating from the pulpit about the scandalous and erroneous predictions in Master Flinkpennig's latest almanac concerning a three-headed goat that will allegedly win the village lottery. Good times. Historians still debate the extent to which the proliferation of printed calendars and almanacs immediately altered the fundamental worldview of the average peasant or artisan. Did it rapidly shift them from a purely natural, liturgical sense of time to a more abstract, calendrical one? Or was it a much slower, more gradual overlay? With the old ways persisting alongside the new printed guides, it was almost certainly a gradual fusion. But the very presence of these printed items in increasing numbers meant that a standardized, quantifiable, and predictable framework for time was becoming more accessible to more people. Daily life was still tied to the sun and the seasons, but it was also increasingly punctuated by the dates and deadlines found on a printed page. A quiet but significant step towards the more regimented, clock-driven world we inhabit today. The tick-tock of the future was, in a way, first heard in the rustle of a printed almanac. The printing press, as we're discovering, isn't just about standardizing languages or helping you remember when it's St. Swithin's Day. Its ability to reproduce texts quickly, cheaply, and in vast quantities had a truly earth-shattering impact on one of the most powerful institutions of medieval daily life, the church. The press became a key engine driving the momentous religious upheavals of the 16th century, most notably the Protestant Reformation. And in doing so, it profoundly altered how ordinary people interacted with and understood their faith. Before print, your access to religious doctrine and scripture was almost entirely mediated by the clergy. You'd hear the Bible read in Latin during Mass, a language most people didn't understand. You'd listen to sermons from your local priest, and you'd see religious stories depicted in stained glass windows, sculptures, or mystery plays. Personal copies of the Bible were virtually non-existent for anyone outside the wealthiest echelons of the church, or nobility, due to the immense cost and labor involved in hand-copying such a large text. Your faith was, in many ways, what the church told you it was. It was a bit like getting all your news from a single TV channel that only broadcasts in a language you don't speak. You're relying heavily on the anchor's interpretation. Then comes the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's first major project, as we know, was his magnificent Latin Bible. While these initial printed Bibles were still expensive, the technology quickly advanced, and printers began to produce smaller but more affordable editions, not just of the Bible but of other religious texts, prayer books, catechisms, and devotional literature. And crucially, they began to print these works not just in Latin, but in the vernacular, the everyday languages of the people, like German, English, and French. A historical fact of immense significance is that Martin Luther's German translation of the New Testament, first printed in 1522, the September Testament, became a bestseller, with thousands of copies disseminated rapidly across German-speaking lands. For the first time, literate laypeople could potentially read the scriptures for themselves, in their own tongue, without relying solely on the interpretation of the priest. This was revolutionary. It was like the director's commentary, the script, and the deleted scenes all being released to the public at once. The press became the chosen instrument for reformers like Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli to spread their theological arguments and critiques of the established church. Their 95 theses, sermons, commentaries, and polemical pamphlets could be printed in large numbers and distributed far more quickly and widely than any handwritten tract. Luther himself called printing God's highest and extremest act of grace, whereby the business of the gospel is driven forward. He understood its power. These printed materials allowed new religious ideas to bypass traditional channels of authority, to cross borders and to take root in the popular consciousness. You could be a merchant in Antwerp, a student in Paris, or a craftsman in Augsburg, and you might encounter these challenging new ideas through a cheaply printed pamphlet bought from a traveling bookseller or passed from hand to hand. This flood of printed religious material had a profound impact on personal piety and daily religious life. It encouraged a more individual, text-based form of devotion. People could potentially read psalms, prayers, and biblical stories in their own homes, in their own language. This fostered a direct relationship with the sacred texts, less dependent on the communal rituals and clerical interpretations that had characterized medieval faith. Of course, literacy was still a major barrier for many, but even for the illiterate, the presence of these vernacular texts was significant. They could be read aloud in family groups, in clandestine meetings of religious dissenters, or by literate friends. The word was literally becoming more accessible. A quirky tidbit, the printing press also led to a boom in the production of printed images, often woodcuts, with religious themes. These could be simple illustrations of biblical scenes, portraits of reformers, or even satirical cartoons attacking the Pope or other church figures. These images were powerful tools for communicating messages to a population that was still largely unable to read complex texts. A picture, as they say, is worth 1,000 words, especially if those words are in a language you don't understand or can't read. So, you might have a printed sheet with a lurid woodcut of, say, the Pope being depicted as the Antichrist, alongside some simple inflammatory rhyming verses. Very shareable content for the 16th century. Historians still debate the extent to which the printing press caused the Reformation versus simply facilitating it. Was it the spark that lit the fire, or the wind that fanned the flames that were already smoldering due to existing social, political, and religious tensions? It was almost certainly a complex interplay. The press didn't create the desire for religious reform, but it provided an unprecedentedly powerful means for articulating, disseminating, and debating those desires on a mass scale. It transformed theological disputes from scholarly arguments confined to university halls into widespread public controversies that could mobilize populations and reshape nations. The quiet clatter of the press was echoing with the thunder of religious revolution, and daily life, particularly its spiritual dimension, was being profoundly and permanently altered. The printing press is now filling the towns and cities of late medieval and early Renaissance Europe with an ever-increasing variety of textual materials, not just Bibles and theological arguments, but also those calendars, almanacs, news sheets, pamphlets, and even pattern books we've talked about. All this newly available printed stuff is wonderful, but it highlights a rather significant bottleneck. What's the use of all these words on paper if most people can't actually read them? You're standing at a pivotal moment, the dawn of a slow, uneven, but ultimately transformative bloom in literacy. A change quietly watered by the ink of the printing press. Before print, as we've established, literacy was the preserve of a select few, primarily clergy, nobility, some wealthy merchants, and professional scribes. For the vast majority of the population, the agricultural laborers, the urban artisans, the common soldiers, reading and writing were arcane skills, as remote from their daily lives as alchemy or astrology, though they might encounter the results of astrology in those printed almanacs. Their world was one of oral tradition, visual symbols, and communal memory. The idea of sitting down to quietly read a text for personal information or pleasure was simply not part of their experience. It would be like expecting your average medieval peasant to suddenly start coding in Python. The tools and the context just weren't there. The advent of printing didn't magically make everyone literate overnight. Far from it. The rise in literacy was a gradual, complex process that unfolded over centuries, influenced by many factors including religious movements, economic changes, and evolving educational philosophies. However, the increased availability and affordability of printed materials undoubtedly played a crucial role as both a catalyst and a facilitator. For the first time, there was simply more stuff to read, and it was cheaper to acquire. This created both an incentive and an opportunity for more people to learn. Why bother learning to decipher letters if the only texts available are impossibly expensive? Latin manuscripts locked away in a monastery, but if you can buy a cheaply printed ballad sheet, a devotional image with a simple prayer, or an almanac that promises to tell you your fortune, the motivation to learn, or at least to have your children learn, starts to increase. A key historical fact is that the Protestant Reformation, which itself was massively propelled by the printing press, placed a strong emphasis on individual Bible reading. Reformers believed that all Christians should have direct access to the scriptures in their own language. This spurred efforts to translate and print the Bible in vernacular tongues and also encouraged the establishment of schools to teach basic literacy so that people could read these sacred texts for themselves. In Protestant regions, learning to read became, for some, a religious duty as much as a practical skill. Here, young Hans, finish your gruel and then practice your letters. How else will you read Pastor Luther's latest tract on the importance of good German sausage? Okay, maybe not the sausage part, but the literacy drive was real. The expanding world of commerce also created a growing need for practical literacy. Merchants needed to read contracts, keep accounts, and correspond with partners in distant cities. Artisans might need to consult printed manuals or pattern books, as printed forms, ledgers, and business correspondence became more common, as we'll explore more later. Basic literacy became an increasingly valuable asset in the urban workplace. A quirky tidbit, one of the ways literacy might have spread in a semi-literate society was through shared reading experiences. Even if only one person in a household or workshop could read fluently, they could read aloud from a printed sheet to others, who might follow along, gradually picking up letter recognition and basic reading skills themselves. Or children who learned to read at a local parish school or from a tutor might then teach their parents or siblings. It was a slow diffusion, often happening in informal settings. The first book clubs probably involved one person reading a scandalous pamphlet aloud in a tavern, with much pointing and head-scratching at the tricky words. However, it's important not to overstate the speed of this literacy bloom. For centuries after the invention of printing, a significant portion of the European population remained illiterate or only semi-literate, able to sign their name or decipher very simple texts. Perhaps the availability of books didn't automatically create readers. Access to education, the perceived need for literacy in one's daily life, social class, and gender all played significant roles. Women, for example, generally had fewer educational opportunities than men, though literacy rates among women, particularly in certain Protestant areas or among the urban middle classes, did begin to rise. Historians still debate the precise metrics and timelines of literacy growth in different regions of Europe during this period. It's difficult to get accurate figures as literacy itself can be defined in many ways. Does signing your name count? Does being able to slowly read a simple prayer make you literate? Regardless of the exact numbers, the overall trend is undeniable. The printing press, by making text more abundant and accessible, created an environment that was more conducive to the acquisition of reading skills than ever before. The reader's dawn was a slow one, with many false starts and regional variations. But the light of the printed word was gradually beginning to illuminate minds that had previously lived only in an oral world. The rustle of turning pages was ever so quietly starting to become a more common sound in medieval daily life. The printing press isn't just flooding Europe with Bibles, ballads, and almanacs. It's also quietly but surely worming its way into the very engine room of late medieval and early modern society, the world of commerce, bureaucracy, and administration. Before print, if you were a merchant drawing up a contract, a guildmaster recording apprenticeships, or a royal official issuing a tax demand, your life was filled with laborious handwriting, unique documents, and the potential for errors and inconsistencies. Now, imagine the impact of being able to mass-produce standardized forms, official notices, and even advertisements. It's like upgrading from a chisel and stone tablet to a surprisingly efficient, if slightly clunky, early version of Microsoft Office. Consider the daily life of a merchant in a bustling port city like Antwerp or Venice in the late 15th or 16th century. Business is booming, trade routes are expanding, but record keeping is a headache. Every bill of lading, every IOU, every partnership agreement has to be meticulously handwritten. This is time-consuming, prone to scribal errors, and makes it difficult to maintain consistent records. Now, enter the printer. Suddenly, you can have stacks of pre-printed contract forms, with blank spaces left for the specific details, names, dates, amounts. This speeds up transactions, reduces the chance of critical omissions, and creates a more uniform, professional-looking document. A historical fact: commercial printers quickly found a lucrative market producing these kinds of standardized business forms, as well as items like account ledgers with pre-ruled lines and columns, making bookkeeping a slightly less soul-destroying task. Your medieval accountant, no longer having to draw every single line by hand, might even crack a smile. Or not. They were still accountants. This standardization extended to all sorts of administrative tasks. Guilds could print their membership certificates, regulations, and apprenticeship indentures. City councils could issue printed ordinances, tax notices, and public health warnings with greater efficiency and reach. Royal governments, as we've noted, were quick to see the advantages for disseminating laws, proclamations, and official correspondence. The sheer volume of bureaucratic paperwork that could now be generated and distributed was unprecedented. It might not sound glamorous, but this paperwork revolution, fueled by print, was essential for managing increasingly complex societies and economies. You might even say the infamous red tape of bureaucracy got its early start with the help of black ink on cheap printed paper. Please fill out this printed form El Sexy USAV in triplicate and ensure all serifs are correctly aligned, or your request for a new cartwheel permit will be denied. Even advertising, in its nascent forms, benefited from print. A merchant announcing the arrival of a new shipment of spices, a craftsman publicizing his wares, or even a traveling acting troupe promoting their upcoming performance could now use cheaply printed handbills or broadsides to reach a wider audience than word of mouth or town crier ever could. These early advertisements might be simple, perhaps with a crude woodcut illustration and some basic text, but they represented a new way of stimulating demand and connecting buyers with sellers. Imagine a printed flyer: "Ya olde apothecary, fresh leeches just arrived. Special offer buy 3. Get a free pustule lancing offer valid while stocks last. Not liable for excessive bleeding or subsequent ghostly hauntings." A quirky tidbit related to this commercial use of print is the early printing of playing cards. While initially hand-painted and a luxury item, printed playing cards became much cheaper and more widely available, contributing to their popularity as a form of leisure and, of course, gambling. Much to the chagrin of some moralists and church authorities. The press wasn't just printing holy words, it was also printing the devil's picture book, as some called cards. The impact on legal proceedings was also significant. Laws themselves could be printed and disseminated more widely, making them, at least in theory, more accessible to those who could read or have them read. Standardized legal forms for summonses, wills, and property transfers brought a new level of consistency to legal practice. However, this also created new challenges. How did you ensure the authenticity of a printed document? What about forgeries? The legal profession had to adapt to this new world of mass-produced texts. Historians still debate the speed at which printed administrative and commercial materials fully replaced handwritten ones in daily practice, particularly in more remote areas or for smaller businesses. The transition was gradual, and for a long time, manuscript and print coexisted. A small village shopkeeper might still keep his accounts in a handwritten ledger long after a wealthy Venetian merchant was using pre-printed ones. Furthermore, the increased volume of printed paperwork didn't necessarily make life simpler. It could also lead to new layers of bureaucracy and record-keeping requirements. But the overall trend was clear. The printing press was becoming an indispensable tool for the management of trade, governance, and the increasingly complex machinery of daily economic and administrative life. The clatter of the press was now echoing not just in university halls and church scriptoria, but also in counting houses, guild halls, and government offices, quietly oiling the gears of a changing world. While the printing press is busily standardizing legal forms and churning out religious pamphlets, it's also playing a crucial, if perhaps less immediately obvious, role in literally reshaping how people in late medieval and early modern Europe see their world and the worlds beyond. We're talking about the impact of printed maps, charts, and geographical texts. Before print, maps were rare, incredibly expensive handwritten documents, often unique and jealously guarded by rulers, navigators, or wealthy scholars. Now, with the press, geographical knowledge, like so many other forms of information, begins to become more accessible, more standardized, and more widely disseminated, fueling an age of exploration and a profound shift in everyday understanding of the planet. Imagine you're a merchant in the 15th century, planning a risky overland trade venture, or a mariner about to set sail into unfamiliar waters. Your access to accurate geographical information would be extremely limited. You might rely on a portolan chart, a practical navigational chart hand-drawn on vellum, showing coastlines, ports, and rhumbed lines radiating from compass points to help plot courses, if you were lucky enough to get your hands on one. But these were precious, often based on accumulated experience rather than precise surveying, and prone to scribal errors in copying. Or you might rely on ancient, sometimes fanciful, geographical texts like Ptolemy's Geographia, which, while groundbreaking for its time, contained significant inaccuracies. Your mental map of the world would be a patchwork of local knowledge, travelers' tales often exaggerated. Here be dragons, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. And vague, religiously infused notions of distant lands. It's like trying to navigate with a GPS that's mostly powered by rumors and wishful thinking. Then comes the printing press. One of the early triumphs of scholarly printing was the production of new editions of classical geographical works, most notably Ptolemy's Geographia. A key historical fact, the first printed edition of Ptolemy with maps based on his descriptions was produced in Bologna in 1477, followed by many others. While these Ptolemaic maps still contained errors famously underestimating the circumference of the Earth and overextending Asia eastward, which arguably encouraged Columbus in his westward voyage, their widespread availability in printed form provided a common, standardized geographical framework for scholars and navigators across Europe. For the first time, many people could see a representation of the entire known world laid out before them, even if that representation wasn't entirely accurate. As the great voyages of discovery began in the late 15th and 16th centuries, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, the new information flooding back from these expeditions needed to be recorded and disseminated. The printing press was the perfect tool for this. New maps, incorporating the latest discoveries that could be engraved on wood or copper plates and then printed in relatively large numbers. These updated maps, showing previously unknown coastlines, islands, and continents, gradually began to replace the older Ptolemaic views. You could buy a printed map showing the New World, a concept that would have been unimaginable just a generation or two earlier. It was like Google Earth slowly loading, patch by patch, over a period of decades. This had a profound, if subtle, impact on the daily imagination of ordinary people, even those who couldn't read the accompanying texts or afford the more expensive atlases. Single-sheet printed maps, or maps included in popular books or almanacs, began to circulate. The world started to look different. It was no longer just Christendom surrounded by vaguely defined heathen lands. It was a globe, with new continents and vast oceans, increasingly charted and named. This must have been both exciting and unsettling, expanding horizons while also challenging old certainties. A quirky tidbit, some early printed maps still featured fantastical creatures in the unexplored regions, sea serpents, mermaids, and other mythical beasts, a holdover from medieval cartographic traditions, even as the coastlines themselves became more accurate. Okay, so Brazil is real, But let's keep the manticore in the margins, just in case. Uh, the availability of more accurate printed nautical charts also had a direct impact on maritime trade and navigation. While experienced pilots still relied heavily on their practical knowledge, printed charts offered a new tool, a way to share and standardize navigational information. This, in turn, facilitated longer, more ambitious voyages, contributing to the growth of global trade networks and colonial empires. Historians still debate how quickly and deeply this new, printed geographical knowledge filtered down to the general populace and altered their everyday spatial awareness. For a peasant in an inland village, a map of the Americas might still have seemed incredibly remote and abstract. But for those in port cities, for merchants, for sailors, and for the growing literate classes, the world was visibly expanding and becoming more knowable through these printed sheets. The press wasn't just printing words, it was printing new mental landscapes, helping to chart the course not just for ships, but for a new, more globalized consciousness. The "Here be dragons" signs were slowly being erased, replaced by the increasingly confident lines of the cartographer's burin, reproduced 1,000-fold by the clanking press. While scholars are poring over newly printed editions of Ptolemy and merchants are squinting at standardized contract forms, the printing press is also starting to make a different kind of noise in daily life, a more harmonious one. We're talking about the printing of sheet music. Before the mid-15th century, if you wanted to learn a new song or a piece of instrumental music, you'd typically have to learn it by ear from another musician, or if you were very fortunate and literate in musical notation, from a painstakingly handwritten manuscript. Musical manuscripts, like text manuscripts, were rare, expensive, and often confined to church choirs, wealthy courts, or monastic communities. But with the advent of printing, the notes themselves begin to break free, promising to bring shared melodies to a wider, if still select, audience. Imagine you're a musician in, say, late 15th century Venice, a bustling center of early printing. You might be a singer in a church choir, a lute player entertaining in a nobleman's house, or even a member of a small-town band playing for local festivities. Access to new music would be a constant challenge. A choirmaster might have a hand-copied choir book, jealously guarded. A wealthy patron might commission a scribe to copy out a collection of chansons. But for the average musician, the repertoire was often limited to what could be memorized or what was locally popular. It's like trying to be a DJ when you only have access to a handful of very expensive hand-dubbed cassette tapes. The technical challenges of printing music were considerable, arguably even more complex than printing text. Musical notation, with its staves, notes of varying shapes and pitches, and rhythmic symbols, required incredible precision to set in type or to carve onto a woodblock. Early attempts often involved printing the staves separately and then adding the notes by hand, or using multiple impressions, one for the staves, another for the notes, perhaps another for the text if it was a song. A key historical fact is that Ottaviano Petrucci, working in Venice, is generally credited with being the first to print polyphonic music with multiple voice parts from movable type with a high degree of success. His Harmonices Musices Odecaton A, published in 1501, was a landmark collection of secular chansons, showcasing the potential of the new technology. It was still a complex process, likely involving 3 impressions for each page. But the result was a clear, elegant, and reproducible musical score. Petrucci essentially invented music publishing as we know it. The impact of printed music on daily musical life was gradual but significant. For church choirs, it meant access to a wider range of liturgical music and greater uniformity in performance across different establishments. For court musicians and wealthy amateurs, it meant new repertoires of secular songs, dances, and instrumental pieces could be acquired more easily. Collections of lute tablatures, madrigals, and part songs began to appear in print, allowing small groups of musicians to gather and perform together with a shared, legible score. You can almost picture a group of Renaissance friends, a bit like a modern garage band, gathered around a newly purchased printed songbook, trying to master the latest four-part harmony. All right, alto, you're coming in flat on that C sharp again? Petrucci would be horrified. This didn't mean that everyone suddenly had access to stacks of sheet music. Printed music was still relatively expensive initially, and musical literacy itself, the ability to read notation, was a skill possessed by a minority. However, the very existence of printed scores facilitated the spread and standardization of musical pieces. A popular tune, once printed, could travel more easily from Italy to France to Germany, maintaining its essential form rather than being gradually altered through purely oral transmission. A quirky tidbit: some early printed music books were designed to be laid flat on a table so that performers sitting or standing around it could all read their individual parts simultaneously from the same book. This was particularly common for collections of madrigals or part songs intended for social, amateur music making. It speaks to a communal, participatory musical culture that print helped to foster among those who could afford the materials and possess the skills. Historians of music still debate the exact influence of early music printing on musical style and composition. Did the technical limitations or possibilities of print subtly shape the kind of music that was written and disseminated? Did the wider availability of scores lead to a greater emphasis on composer attribution and the concept of a fixed musical work? It likely did, contributing to a shift from a more fluid, improvisational musical culture in some genres towards one where the composer's written score held greater authority. The printing of music also had an impact on musical education. Printed tutors for various instruments began to appear, offering instruction to those who might not have access to a personal teacher. While still a long way from a learn lute in 7 days app, these early printed methods made the rudiments of musical performance slightly more accessible. The soundscape of daily life, particularly in wealthier urban households and courtly circles, was gradually being enriched and diversified by these shared melodies, now captured and disseminated by the clanking, inky embrace of the printing press. The notes were literally flying off the page and into the air with greater ease than ever before. The printing press isn't just serenading Europe with newly accessible melodies or helping merchants keep their ledgers straight. It's also starting to seep into one of the most anxious and uncertain areas of medieval daily life health and medicine. Before print, if you fell ill, your access to medical knowledge was largely dependent on the local wise woman or barber surgeon, perhaps a university-trained physician if you were wealthy and lived in a city, or simply on folk remedies passed down through generations. Medical texts, like all other books, were rare, handwritten, and often confined to monastic libraries or the private collections of learned doctors. Now, with the press, both scholarly medical treatises and more popular health guides, often of dubious quality, begin to circulate more widely, bringing both potential enlightenment and a whole new level of confusion to the ailing medieval patient. Imagine you're feeling unwell in, say, the early 16th century. You've got a persistent cough and a nasty rash. What do? You might consult a local healer who relies on herbal remedies and traditional lore, or if you're a bit more well-to-do, you might seek out someone who has access to written medical knowledge. Before print, this knowledge was often based on ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, whose works had been copied and sometimes misinterpreted or corrupted by scribes for centuries. Now, the printing press starts to churn out new editions of these classical medical texts, as well as contemporary medical commentaries and anatomical atlases. A key historical fact is that Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, On the Fabric of the Human Body, published in 1543 with its detailed and revolutionary anatomical illustrations based on human dissection, was a landmark achievement made possible by printing. It allowed for the accurate reproduction of these groundbreaking images, transforming the study of anatomy. Students across Europe could now, in theory, see the same detailed depictions of the human body, rather than relying on crude, often inaccurate, manuscript illustrations. This was a huge step for medical education, even if actually getting your hands on a cadaver for dissection was still a bit tricky and often involved some rather unsavory grave-robbing shenanigans. However, the printing press was an indiscriminate tool. Alongside these scholarly works, it also spewed forth a torrent of popular medical advice books, collections of herbal remedies, astrological health guides, and what we might charitably call quack literature. These were often cheaply printed, aimed at a wider audience, and filled with a bewildering mix of sensible folk wisdom, ancient superstition, and outright dangerous nonsense. You might find a printed pamphlet advising you to cure your ague by wearing a pouch of dried toad around your neck, or to treat baldness by rubbing your scalp with goose droppings. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Seems like animal byproducts were all the rage in ancient remedies. It was the Wild West of medical information, and the printing press was supplying ammunition to all sides. This explosion of printed medical material had a complex impact on daily health practices. On the one hand, it could empower individuals, at least literate ones, or those who had texts read to them to take a more active role in their own health care. They could consult printed herbals to identify medicinal plants, or read up on the supposed virtues of different foods and regimens. On the other hand, it could also lead to confusion, anxiety, and the adoption of ineffective or harmful treatments. How was the average person with limited education supposed to distinguish between a scholarly treatise based on Vesalius's dissections and a popular pamphlet claiming that drinking an elixir made from powdered unicorn horn would cure all ills? My printed almanac says unicorn horn is excellent for a persistent cough, but Master Apothecary down the lane is pushing this newfangled syrup of fox lungs. Decisions. Decisions. A quirky tidbit is the printing of plague broadsides during outbreaks of bubonic plague. These sheets would often contain official regulations for quarantine, advice on avoiding infection, much of it based on miasma theory, like burning aromatic herbs or avoiding corrupt air, and sometimes rather gruesome woodcuts depicting the horrors of the disease. While intended to inform and control, they also undoubtedly spread fear and, occasionally, misinformation. Historians still debate the net effect of early printed medical literature on public health. Did it, on balance, lead to better health outcomes by disseminating useful knowledge more widely? Or did it primarily contribute to the spread of medical confusion and quackery? It was likely a mixed bag. The press certainly democratized access to medical information, but not necessarily to medical wisdom or effective treatment. It also gradually began to challenge the authority of traditional oral healers and university-trained physicians by making alternative, though not always better, sources of medical advice available to a broader public. The daily experience of sickness and health was slowly being altered. You might still rely on your local healer, but now you might also have a tattered printed herbal or a health almanac tucked away in your cottage, offering its own, sometimes contradictory, advice. The conversation around health was becoming more text-based, more varied, and for the average person navigating this new landscape of printed cures and warnings, probably more bewildering than ever. The path to wellness was now littered with printed pages, some leading to genuine insights, others down a rabbit hole of very strange medieval medicine. The printing press, as we've seen, isn't just changing how people pray, do business, or treat their ailments. It's also beginning to fundamentally alter the way public conversations happen, how opinions are formed, and how political and social ideas are debated. Before print, if you had a strong opinion about the king's new tax or the moral failings of the local clergy, your options for sharing it widely were limited. You could talk about it in the tavern, grumble to your neighbors, or perhaps, if you were brave and articulate, try to address a local gathering. But now, with the advent of cheap, mass-produced pamphlets and broadsides, a new, more expansive public sphere begins to take shape, one where voices and controversies can travel further and faster than ever before. Imagine you're living through a period of social or political unrest in the 16th or 17th century. Perhaps the German Peasants' War, the French Wars of Religion, or the English Civil War. These were times of intense ideological conflict, and the printing press became a crucial weapon for all sides. Reformers, rebels, royalists, parliamentarians, everyone who had a message to spread and a populace to persuade turned to the printer. Pamphlets, often anonymously authored or published under pseudonyms to avoid retribution, would fly off the presses, arguing, accusing, satirizing, and exhorting. It was a war of words, fought with ink and paper, and it was happening in a very public way. You didn't need a fancy manuscript anymore. A few coins could buy you a fiery tract that you could read, share, and discuss. It's like Twitter, but with more paper cuts and a higher chance of being arrested for sedition. These printed materials fostered a new kind of political consciousness. People who might previously have felt isolated in their grievances or opinions could now see those same ideas articulated in print, realizing they were not alone. This could help to galvanize opposition movements, coordinate protests, or simply create a sense of shared identity among groups with common interests. A historical fact during the English Civil War 1642-1651, both royalist and parliamentarian factions made extensive use of printed newsbooks, pamphlets, and propaganda sheets to rally support, vilify their opponents, and shape public perception of the conflict. The press became an indispensable tool of political mobilization. Have you seen the latest diabolical pamphlet from those roundhead scoundrels? Classo, a cavalier might sputter, while a Puritan might be eagerly devouring a printed sermon, justifying Parliament's cause? This burgeoning public discourse wasn't always polite or reasoned. Of course, much like the less savory corners of the internet today, the world of early modern pamphleteering was often characterized by scurrilous accusations, character assassination, sensationalism, and outright lies. But it was also a space where genuine debate could occur, where different viewpoints could clash, and where the actions of rulers and authorities could be subjected to public scrutiny in an unprecedented way. The very act of printing an argument gave it a certain permanence and reach that spoken words lacked. A quirky tidbit, some of these political or satirical pamphlets used crude but effective woodcut illustrations to get their message across, often depicting prominent figures in unflattering or comical ways. These visual satires could be understood even by those who couldn't read the accompanying text, making them potent tools for shaping popular opinion. Imagine a cartoon of a famously corpulent king being roasted on a spit by his long-suffering subjects. It's not subtle, but it gets the point across. The authorities, naturally, were often deeply uncomfortable with this new, untamed sphere of public opinion. They recognized the power of the press to incite dissent and challenge their control. This led to increasingly stringent efforts to regulate printing through licensing systems, censorship boards, and the prosecution of printers or authors deemed to be seditious or heretical. The Stationers' Company in London, for example, was granted a royal charter in 1557, giving it significant powers to control printing and enforce censorship. But trying to completely suppress the flow of illicit or controversial printed matter was like trying to catch smoke with a sieve. If there was a demand for certain ideas, printers, often operating secretly or in more permissive jurisdictions, would find a way to supply them. Historians still debate the true democratizing effect of the early printing press on political discourse. While it certainly broadened the range of voices that could be heard and the number of people who could access political arguments, did it lead to genuine empowerment for the common person? Or did it primarily serve as a tool for elites to manipulate a wider public? The reality is likely complex and varied across different contexts. What is clear is that print fundamentally changed the dynamics of social and political communication. It created a space where ideas could be contested more openly and where public opinion, however ill-defined or manipulated, began to emerge as a force that rulers had to, at least occasionally, reckon with. The quiet whispers of dissent could now become a printed roar, echoing far beyond the confines of the local tavern. Daily life was becoming politicized in new and often unpredictable ways, thanks to the humble yet powerful printing press. As the printing presses clatter and churn, filling Europe with an ever-growing tide of books, pamphlets, broadsides, and forms, there's a quiet tragedy unfolding in the scriptoria and workshops where, for centuries, the written word had been meticulously, lovingly, and laboriously crafted by hand. We're talking about the scribes, Those highly skilled artisans whose entire profession, whose very identity was bound up with the painstaking art of manuscript production. The rise of print, with its speed, efficiency, and affordability, spelled a slow but inexorable decline for this ancient and honorable craft. It's the classic tale of technological disruption, played out in quill pens and vellum, centuries before robots started eyeing factory jobs. Imagine you were a scribe in, say, Paris or Florence in the late 15th or early 16th century. For years, perhaps decades, you have dedicated your life to the meticulous copying of texts. You've mastered different scripts, the formal Gothic textura for liturgical works, the more flowing cursive for personal letters or business documents. You know how to prepare parchment, mix inks, rule lines, and perhaps even add simple decorative initials. Your work is highly valued if often poorly remunerated. You are a guardian of knowledge, a conduit through which the wisdom of the ancients and the doctrines of the Church are preserved and transmitted. It's a demanding, eye-straining, and often solitary profession, but it has dignity and purpose. Your hands are the printers of your age. Then, you start to hear about this newfangled invention from Germany, this artificial writing that can produce hundreds of identical copies of a page in a single day. At first, you might dismiss it. Surely, a machine cannot replicate the beauty and artistry of a hand-illuminated manuscript. Surely, discerning patrons will always prefer the unique, bespoke quality of a book written by a skilled human hand. And for a while, especially for luxury items, this holds true. Wealthy collectors and high-ranking church officials continue to commission sumptuous hand-illuminated manuscripts as status symbols and works of art, sometimes even having printed books embellished by hand to give them that traditional, luxurious feel. It's like people today still buying vinyl records or handcrafted furniture in an age of digital music and mass-produced goods. There's an appreciation for the artisanal, but for the vast majority of textual needs, Bibles for parish churches, university textbooks, legal documents, commercial forms, popular pamphlets, the speed and lower cost of printing become impossible to ignore. A historical fact, by 1500, just a few decades after Gutenberg's Bible, it's estimated that printing presses were operating in over 250 towns and cities across Europe and had already produced millions of printed items. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Scribes simply could not compete on price or speed for most types of textual reproduction. Their niche was shrinking. The impact on individual scribes would have varied. Some, particularly those with exceptional artistic skills as illuminators or calligraphers, might have found continued employment embellishing printed books or producing high-end luxury manuscripts for a niche market. Others might have transitioned into the new printing industry itself, using their existing literacy and knowledge of text to become typesetters, proofreaders, or editors in printing houses. This would have been a significant shift from the quiet, individual craft of the scriptorium to the noisier, more collaborative, and often more pressured environment of a commercial print shop. Imagine going from a serene monastery library to a bustling workshop filled with the clank of the press, the smell of oil-based ink, and the shouted commands of a busy master printer. Hurry up with that form. Thomas, we've got an order for 500 copies of witty sayings of Saint Jerome, due by Vespers. However, for many ordinary jobbing scribes, who made their living from routine copying tasks, legal documents, business letters, less ornate books, the decline in demand for their traditional skills would have been a serious blow. Their livelihood was being undercut by a machine. A quirky tidbit is that some scribes reportedly complained bitterly about the poor quality of early printed books, their soulless uniformity, and the errors made by careless printers. There was likely a degree of professional pride and perhaps a touch of Luddite-esque resentment towards this new technology that was rendering their hard-won skills increasingly obsolete. Johannes Trithemius, a German abbot and scholar, wrote a treatise in 1492 titled De Laude Scriptorum, in praise of scribes, passionately defending the spiritual and intellectual value of manual transcription, even as the printing press was gaining ascendancy. He argued that the act of copying itself was a meditative, educational practice, and that handwritten books on parchment would last longer than flimsy printed paper. He was fighting a valiant, but ultimately losing battle against the tide of technological change. Historians still debate the social and economic consequences for the scribal profession as a whole. Did it lead to widespread unemployment and destitution among former scribes? Or was the transition more gradual, with many finding new roles in the expanding print ecosystem or other literate professions? The picture is complex and varied by region. What is certain is that the centuries-old tradition of the professional scribe as the primary producer of texts was coming to an end. The printing press didn't just create a new way of making books, it fundamentally restructured the entire economy of the written word, and those whose skills were tied to the old ways had to adapt or fade away. The quiet scratch of the quill was being replaced by a louder, more industrious, and ultimately more powerful sound. We've journeyed through the clatter of early print shops, witnessed the spread of broadsides and Bibles, seen language itself begin to standardize, and watched as new public spheres of debate emerged. The printing press, an invention born in the mid-15th century, was clearly more than just a new way to make books. Its impact, often subtle and unfolding over generations, wove itself into the very warp and weft of late medieval and early modern daily life, quietly transforming how ordinary people experience their world, their faith, their work, and their connection to each other. It's in these myriad small, everyday shifts that the true, quiet revolution of print can be found. Think about the visual landscape of a town or city. Before print, public spaces were dominated by spoken proclamations, by religious symbols in churches, by the coats of arms on buildings. Now, gradually printed notices, advertisements, official decrees, and even satirical posters begin to appear on walls, church doors, and tavern notice boards. The urban environment itself becomes more textual. You might not be able to read it all yourself, but you're increasingly surrounded by the visible presence of the printed word, a constant reminder of a wider world of information and communication. Your daily walk through town is subtly different, punctuated by these paper pronouncements. Consider the home. For most medieval households, a book, any book, would have been an unimaginable luxury. Daily life was not organized around private reading, but as printing makes text cheaper and more plentiful, items like a printed almanac, a small devotional booklet, a collection of ballads, or even a single-sheet woodcut with a moral tale might find their way into more modest homes. This doesn't mean every cottage suddenly had a library, far from it. But the possibility of owning a piece of printed matter, of having access to a text within the domestic space, was a profound change. It opened up new avenues for private reflection, family reading if someone was literate, or simply a new topic of conversation. A historical fact inventories of personal belongings from the 16th century onwards increasingly start to list small numbers of printed books even among moderately well-off artisans and farmers, something that would have been exceptionally rare a century earlier. The humble bookshelf, or at least a small pile of printed sheets, was beginning its journey to becoming a standard piece of furniture. The nature of work also began to shift, as we saw with scribes and the rise of printed business forms. But think also of artisans, printed pattern books for textiles, metalwork, or architecture allowed for the wider dissemination of designs and techniques, leading to greater stylistic coherence across regions, but also perhaps enabling individual craftsmen to expand their repertoires. A skilled blacksmith might now have access to a printed sheet showing new designs for iron railings that were popular in a distant city, something he previously might only have heard about vaguely, if at all. It's like Pinterest, but on very slow, hand-delivered paper. Even leisure and entertainment were touched by print. Those printed ballads we mentioned could be bought for a pittance and sung at home or in company. Printed playing cards became ubiquitous. Collections of jokes, fables, or popular stories began to circulate, providing new forms of amusement. While oral storytelling and communal festivities remained central to medieval leisure, print offered new, more individualized and transportable forms of entertainment. A quirky tidbit, some of the earliest printed how-to guides started to appear, covering everything from fishing and hunting to chess and even, sometimes rather dubiously, how to interpret dreams or find buried treasure. The self-help industry has very deep, inky roots. This quiet transformation wasn't always smooth or universally welcomed. We've seen how authorities worried about the spread of dissenting ideas and sought to control the press. Some scholars lamented what they saw as a decline in the quality of thought, fearing that the sheer volume of printed material would lead to superficial reading and a loss of the deep engagement that came from slowly copying or memorizing a manuscript. There were concerns about the accuracy of printed texts, the potential for errors to be multiplied rapidly, and the spread of misinformation. These are anxieties that echo even today in our own digital information age. Historians still debate the pace and uniformity of print's integration into daily life across different social classes and geographical regions. The impact was certainly felt more quickly and profoundly in urban centers with active printing presses and higher literacy rates than in remote rural communities. But the direction of change was undeniable. The printing press acted as a subtle but persistent catalyst, altering not just grand intellectual currents or religious doctrines, but the small, everyday interactions, assumptions, and experiences of ordinary people. It changed how they learned about the world, how they organized their time, how they conducted their business, how they worshipped, how they entertained themselves, and even how they saw themselves in relation to a wider, increasingly textualized society. The ink, once confined to the precious vellum of monastic scriptoria, was now seeping into every corner of daily existence, leaving an indelible mark on the fabric of a world transitioning from medieval to modern. And so, the clatter of Gutenberg's press fades into the quiet hum of your own evening. We've journeyed from a world where words were rare and precious, handcrafted treasures, to one where ink and paper began to reshape the everyday in countless, often unseen ways. The shift was monumental, not always loud or dramatic in its daily unfolding, but as profound as any battle or coronation. It was a quiet revolution, measured in printed sheets and slowly spreading literacy, changing the very texture of life. As you let these thoughts settle, allow the image of that early printer, with his oil-stained hands and his world-changing machine, to recede. The anxieties and excitements of that dawning age of print can give way now to the calm of the present. The information age that they unknowingly began has its own complexities, but tonight you can set those aside. May your mind be as clear as a freshly printed page, and your rest as deep and undisturbed as a long-forgotten manuscript, waiting patiently for the morning light. End of script. Sweet dreams.